Welcome back. We're inside the halls of the UN climate talks in Durban, South Africa. The interview you just saw was shot with Rear Admiral David Titley a few hours ago, right here in these halls. Now we have the honor of being joined by Praful Bidwai. Praful is a writer, an activist, a fellow with the Transnational Institute. He wears a lot of hats. I think what can be said is he's very knowledgeable about India's role, and really everything that's going on here at the UN climate talks. So we'll be interested to get the Indian perspective now. You wrote a book. I'm going to hold it up here so people can see it. It's called "The Politics of Climate Change and the Global Crisis." And I notice, we'll start off with this. I noticed the first chapter of the book is called "The Doomsday Clock."
Right.
So tell us about the Doomsday Clock.
Well, the Doomsday Clock is an image that was created by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, among them Albert Einstein, who wanted to warn the world about the dangers of nuclear weapons. And so they had this picture of a clock where the closer the minute hand is to midnight, the closer the world is to ultimate doom and extinction. So during the Cold War, the Second Cold War, the hand was as close as 4 minutes to midnight. Now it's been set back to 7 minutes to midnight. I think that image is very, very appropriate to understanding just how dangerous climate change is and what it means for the world in terms of the severity of the crisis. We are at a point where, unless there is a peaking of greenhouse gas emissions which are warming up the atmosphere, the world could become 3 to 4, maybe even 5 degrees warmer than at pre-industrial levels, when science is very clear that the very maximum that the Earth can tolerate by way of global warming is 2 degrees. Many scientists say 1.5 degrees. At 3 degrees, in fact, a lot of tipping points will be crossed beyond which remedial action becomes futile. And at 4 degrees, according to many scientists, including Britain's best-known climate scientist, Kevin Anderson, only about 1/10 of the world's population will survive. It's as grim as that. And our chance to act is now. That's why I think the Doomsday Clock is a very important image, and I argue that today the world is roughly 2 minutes away from midnight, and it must act. In the next what it does in the next 5 years is absolutely crucial. The developed countries, which have contributed 3/4 of all the emissions accumulated in the atmosphere, must reach a peak of their emissions in the next 2-3 years, and then reduce their emissions by 2020 by something like 40%, right, over 1990 levels.
Before 2020.
Before 2020. The big emerging economies like India and China must reduce the amount of carbon they use per unit of output, per unit of production in their economies, and get onto a low carbon development pathway. And by 2050, the world must reduce its total of emissions by something like 80 to 90% if we are going to survive the climate crisis. Otherwise, we are really doomed. The time to act is now. And that's what the Doomsday Clock image is meant to convey.
So you've been following these negotiations here the last week or so, and the beginning of this week. So is that what we're on target to do? Is that what negotiators are talking about?
I'm afraid not. The negotiators are not even talking about their own commitments, especially the developed countries' commitments made at Copenhagen 2 years ago and Cancun last year. They are forgetting that they had pledged way back 20 years ago to reach a peak of their emissions by the year 2000. Their emissions are still rising. The United States they never signed the only agreement in the world which has legally binding force as in international law pertaining to the climate. That's the Kyoto Protocol, which came into force in 2005, and it never ratified it. So it's actually still emitting rapidly. Canada and Australia are going to miss their Kyoto targets by 30% or more. Even countries like France, Italy, and the Netherlands are going to miss their Kyoto targets. This despite the fact that they've used very cheap and easy means to show compliance with Kyoto targets by buying up cheap carbon credits from abroad. and by hiding behind the collapsed economies of the former Eastern Bloc states, and in spite of that, their performance is absolutely dismal. See, the world needs to cut its total emissions by something like, by something like 20 billion tons of carbon dioxide, and it's short of that by something like 12 billion. So this is a huge gigaton gap, and unless it's filled, unless it's bridged, we are going to have very high, unsustainable levels of global warming. The sad thing is that the developed countries have not lived up to their commitment at all. And over the last 2 years, the world has moved from a discourse and targets for emissions reductions based on science, good science and equity, to arbitrary pledges made by national governments. And the pledges of the developing countries are anything between 35 and 300% higher than those of the developed countries. So that actually reverses the whole principle of climate responsibility and of the which is at the foundation, which is at the heart of the climate convention, which was agreed in 1992.
So what you're saying is that the poorer countries of the world are actually doing more
Yes.
than the wealthier countries to cut back on carbon emissions and to deal with the climate change issues. And there's a real issue of justice and equity there.
Absolutely, and I'm saying that this inverts the whole principle of common and differentiated responsibility.
What is that? Can you explain that for our viewers?
What this says is that it is the common duty of all countries to combat climate change, but that responsibility is not equally divided between different countries. It must be proportional to the contribution that they have made to global warming. So if the developed countries are responsible for 3/4 of all emissions accumulated in the atmosphere, they should take a proportionate responsibility for cutting emissions. Right?
That's sort of like the old concept of the polluter pays. You
That's
pollute
right.
something, you have to take care of it afterwards.
You got it absolutely, bang on. That's what the polluter pays principle is completely subverted by the kind of pledges that the developed countries have extracted from weak and poor developing countries which have very little leverage, and they were coerced, bullied, and arm twisted into making these emission reduction pledges, which are totally disproportionate to their contribution.
But the bigger issue there is not how much the developing countries are doing, but it's how little the developed countries are doing, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I would add to the list the future commitments of the emerging economies too. I belong to India, which is part of the BASIC group, which emerged 2 years ago. BASIC stands for Brazil, South Africa, India and China. These are among the bigger polluters now, emerging polluters. China is in a different league altogether. China overtook the United States 3 years ago as the biggest emitter in the world. India is, of course, much lower than that. It's the fourth largest to the fifth largest, depending on how you count it. But these countries have to make some commitments themselves. They have made some, and some of those have to be translated into perhaps binding agreements at a later stage. But the responsibility, the first steps must be taken by the developed countries, in particular countries like the United States, which account for more than a quarter of all emissions that have accumulated in the atmosphere in the world.
So we've been going through this UN process here year after year after year. This is the 17th negotiation on this this particular treaty, but these types of negotiations have been going on even longer than that.
20 years almost, yeah.
And as you've pointed out, time after time after time, promises have been broken, pledges have been made, they haven't been followed through on. What are we still doing here after all these years?
We are trying to gather the pieces, honestly. We're trying to see if, even at this stage, it's possible to work out two things. One is a return to a top-down approach. That might sound like a bad word, but it's based on science and equity, which tells us who should cut how much of their emissions and by what date. And we need to return to that. Second, that can be done if this sole legally binding agreement of the world pertaining to climate, namely the Kyoto Protocol, is extended. It is on life support, its effective legal force will expire next year in 2012. So we need a further commitment period for 5 years or longer for the Kyoto Protocol.
Can I break that down with you for 1 second? Because we've heard a lot of talk about the Kyoto Protocol here, and now there's talk that it will be extended, but it may be extended on life support. We've heard that several times too. But the countries that look to be extending the Kyoto Protocol include the EU and the least developed countries. And totally, in total, those countries only account for a small percentage of the world's global greenhouse emissions. So why does that matter so much if it's only covering such a small percentage of the world's greenhouse gas emissions anyway?
No, it does matter because it's not just these countries. It's also the group of developing countries called G77 and China, the entire bloc which accounts for a very large proportion of now something like 55% of the world's emissions. So along with the EU, you have a pretty big total such as 65%, 70%. Of the world's emissions. So that's a very substantial number.
Except that under the Kyoto Protocol, China is not bound to reduce its emissions and set binding targets.
No, that's fine, but it has offered, in spite of that, to reduce the emissions intensity, that is to say the carbon footprint of its production by 40 to 45% by 2020. This is a voluntary commitment, and China says it's willing to make this into a binding commitment at a future stage. But let there be a review first of who has done what. And this review is meant to be completed between 2013 and 2015. Then the world will be clearer also as to what needs to be done in terms of what the science tells us. Because the fifth report of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has 4,000 scientists from all over the world telling us how grim the climate crisis is, will be published in 2013 or so, and then we'll have a much better idea. So I think the Chinese are being reasonable, and so is the basic group, which says let the developed countries first deliver on what they have already agreed to do, and only then will we talk of future commitments. But let there be some action on the ground. Right now we are doing more than we have walked the extra mile. And that's not fair because that subverts the polluter pays principle. And I think that there's a strong argument in favor of that view. So I think the developed countries have to show initiative. In particular, the European Union, which has played a progressive role in the past, which is now turning conservative under the impact of the Great Recession, must revise its stand and make a completely unconditional and categorical commitment to extending the Kyoto Protocol, and then also contribute to the Green Climate Fund. It's a very important measure that the world agreed to take in Cancun. It's a 100 billion strong fund which must be created by 2020, which will finance the mitigation and adaptation efforts of the developing countries, the poorest of them in particular, and the faster actual funds flow into this particular facility, the better it will be for the world, and the greater the impact in confidence building.
So you make some very strong arguments about why developed countries should do more and should be doing more than they've pledged and should then follow through with new pledges. But how can the developing countries extract those pledges? What can they do to make the developed world come to the table on this?
Frankly, that's the whole problem. If the developed countries are cynical and are using all kinds of subterfuge, all kinds of coercion to duck their commitments, then there's not much that the world can do. But I think the basic group of Brazil, South Africa, India and China can play an important role in bringing a much more sharply focused kind of pressure on the developed world and say, look, we are prepared we walk the extra mile, we'll walk another extra mile if you guys deliver on your commitment. So that's a way of, I think there's some possibility there of generating a momentum once again. And I think this is what we need to see happening in the next 3 days, next 4 days of the climate conference.
In this basic group, Brazil, South Africa, China, and India, it's really emerged over the last couple of years as a force here in these negotiations. Where did it come from?
Well, they have emerged as the biggest, some of the biggest emitters. I mean, there's still, China is number one, the United States number two. Russia is number 3, EU is number 4, India is number 5, and so on and so forth. So over the years, they have recognized that they have to do a little more and they just can't be seen as other developing countries like the rest, and that they do bear some responsibility, and therefore they formed a grouping two years ago. Unfortunately, at Copenhagen, the basic group and the United States colluded to produce a deal which imposes no real obligations on anyone. These are voluntary pledges, and all the world can do, and the Climate Convention can do, is monitor compliance with those pledges. But those pledges are paltry, and they do not correspond to what is necessary to stabilize the climate. They do not remotely add up to the kinds of emissions reductions that the world needs in order that we do not cross a series of tipping points.
If we were to extract binding pledges, and if countries were to come to the table and say we're willing to be bound by a treaty to make a certain amount of pledges in a certain amount of reductions in our greenhouse gas emissions, and then they again didn't follow through on those pledges, as they have time and again failed to do, what could be done? What do you do when a country misses its targets? How do they get punished?
There are penalty clauses, and those have to be explicitly written into the agreement. Under the Kyoto Protocol, there are penal clauses, and fines can be imposed. Also, further obligations in the future can be imposed. All manner of other means can be invoked, and I think Canada could be a test case, because Canada is threatening to walk out of Kyoto having violated its own commitments, its own pledges. So I think Canada should be made a test case, so that it's actually faced with a fine and with infamy and a certain degree of disgracing. And it's a way of shaming a large country like Canada, which is some of the highest per capita emissions in the world, into behaving responsibly. But there are these penal clauses written into the Climate Convention, and those need to be evoked.
How does reputation and trust play into all this? Because we think of those things as things that really only matter between people and human beings, but that matters for countries as well, doesn't it?
It does, and I think the bulk of the world's countries would not like to be seen to be in blatant breach of what they themselves said. Many of them probably feel that they owe an obligation to their own peoples too. For instance, the European Union is answerable to its own populations, and most people in Europe are far more aware than, say, Americans are about the dangers of climate change and about the need for the European Union to cut its emissions drastically. They have a stake themselves in that kind of future.
Before we went on air, we were talking earlier about this idea of taking nation states out of the equation. What do you mean by that?
What I mean is, if we draw what we might call a very different criterion, divide the world's population, world's people, 7 billion people, not according to the nation, the country in which they live, but according to their standard of living. Let's call it the development threshold.
So you've got poor people in America, you've got poor people in India, you've got poor people in China, you've got poor people in Europe, and they're all below this line.
They are below this line, and then they have a solidarity, basis for solidarity. They should not be asked to bear the burden of climate remediation. It is those who are above that line, and way above that line should have progressively higher obligations. For instance, a rag picker in Delhi, which is the city I come from.
These are the people that just go around and pick up the trash and try and earn a little money off of it.
They actually clean up. They actually recycle waste. So they have negative emissions. The poor people who are homeless in New York, or are tribal communities of indigenous forest-dwelling people, have no emissions. In fact, they're negative emissions. So that kind of bond of solidarity needs to be built across nations. And the rich, who are consuming more, who are spending loads of money on luxuries which are emissions intensive, have to bear the burden progressively. What I mean is, if you're a millionaire, then your millionth dollar will be taxed much higher than your thousandth dollar, the 10,000th dollar.
Well, we do that already in terms of economic taxation, but how would that translate into a carbon tax or a carbon equity, sense of equity?
For instance, they can be asked to meet the burden of mitigation of climate change, of reducing emissions themselves, or helping others, financing other people's emissions reductions by taking on responsibilities. Right now, progressive taxation is very mild. I mean, you have some of the biggest millionaires in the world saying tax us more. The owner of Walmart no, what's his name? Sorry,
Warren Buffett.
Warren Buffett started it, and then people like George Soros joined in, saying we are prepared to pay more. So I think, well, for instance, corporations pay less than 30% tax on their top, income bracket. That needs to be raised, but you also need to link it with their emissions. And the more you emit, the big energy companies ought to be taxed much more heavily so that they can actually finance emissions reductions and adaptation to climate change in the poorer countries.
So would this work in terms of a global carbon tax that you would actually pay, every individual, every corporation would pay a certain amount of money based on their own carbon footprint?
Yes, there could be a carbon tax. There could be other means of raising the finance through national and international mechanisms. There could be a way of isolating the biggest emitters in terms of the energy companies and so on and so forth, and then treating them very differently from ordinary people and so on and so forth. So you can do that. You can tax oil and coal and gas at their source and generate the funds that you need to stabilize the climate. And we need innovative methods. That's for the future. But I think we need first a commitment to deliver on what was pledged in the past, and that is what I think Durban should produce and is legitimately expected to produce.
And let's just talk briefly about your country, India, and their role here in these talks.
Right.
How do you feel that they've played a productive role here in moving the discussions forward?
I think so. I think I'm not a climate nationalist, and I want my government to do much more domestically for the poor people who are, bulk of the Indian population, who are very, very vulnerable to climate change. We have a long coastline, 7,500 kilometers. We have the melting of the Himalayan glaciers. We treat some of our greatest rivers. This makes for instability in rainfall, in moisture precipitation. Our agriculture is losing its productivity because of pollution of the soil, all kinds of problems. So we have more hurricanes. At the same time, we have droughts in parts of the country. So I want my government to do much more. But I think here, it's actually talking about equity, at least at the international level. And it's very important to return to the discourse of equity and science-based responsibility. And I think the BASIC group held a press conference today, that's the 6th of December, and they came through as pretty convincing as a united group, which does remind the world of some of the unaddressed agendas in the climate change debate.
And do you think that group has enough strength here to really make the difference and bring the key countries, US, EU, to the table in the way that so far they've been hesitant to come?
I'm not too sure, but I think they could play their cards tactfully and achieve a great deal in the next 2 or 3 days. And I think, in particular, if they break the resistance being put up by some of the poorest of small island states and the least developing countries, which are being offered finance by the developed countries, and say, okay, we will give you technology, we will try and contribute to your mitigation and adaptation effort, and play their cards well, then they ought to be able to overcome the bullying tactics of the developed countries and make for a much more equitable climate agreement.
And just to finish up, the picture you painted in the beginning of this interview was quite bleak. We're on a very dangerous trajectory, you pointed out, and it's unclear so far that there's the political will to come back from that trajectory. Mm-hmm. Do you still have hope in this process?
I have some hope because, but a lot depends on whether we actually overcome the toxic legacy of Copenhagen and Cancun, which saw the world move away from commitments and pledges based on science and equity to arbitrary pledges. And if we return to the original agenda, I think we'll have rescued the world from a lot of damage that has occurred in the last 2 years and more.
Great. Well, we'll keep an eye on things the next couple of days, and we'd love to have you back from time to time just to talk about these things and see how things progress.
Absolutely. Thanks
Great.
very much. Good. It was good talking to you.
Great. Thank you, Praful. Great. So that was our interview with Praful Bidwai. I'm just going to check now to see what we have in